Playing strategically, formerly known as tunneling, camping, and slugging, albeit incredibly efficient ways to win matches, are extremely unfun to play against, and although it is in no way your responsibility to care about the fun of the other team in an online competitive multiplayer game, it is still true that if every killer who played Dead by Daylight used these strategies, the game would no longer exist. Now, there was a time when you did have to care about the other people you were playing with, otherwise they wouldn't play with you anymore. However, that is no longer the current reality of gaming. That's why game developers need to put us in our high chairs and spoon feed us perfectly balanced gameplay so we stop crying. The question is though, how do you balance a game that is inherently impossible to balance? In addition, the more behavior attempts to balance the game for the highest level of players, the more the game completely falls apart for less skilled players, or even just players who have taken a short break from the game. Now, with almost any other game, the answer here would be to just get good, but the problem here is that DBD is essentially a party game with iconic horror characters, and trying to turn it into an esport for a minority of tryhards is incredibly short-sighted and will kill the game in the long run. That said, I do think this can be navigated or at least mitigated with smart balance changes. That's why in this video I'm going to detail exactly how to balance this game for high-level players without ruining the game for everyone else. For example, changing certain loops and map design will have a very minor impact on lesser skilled players because they don't know how to run loops or optimize their pathing and usually go down in a chase quite quickly, whereas increasing the amount of time it takes survivors to do generators completely eradicates less efficient or skilled survivors. So clearly map and loop design is far more important than gen speed when it comes to making smart balance changes. That doesn't mean gen speed is perfect. There are clearly still issues when it comes to certain items and perks, but it's like drying the floor while there's still a leak in your roof. The skill ceiling with survivor is just too high in comparison to almost every killer. A highly skilled survivor can run an equally high skilled killer 4 or 5 gens if that killer doesn't have any anti-loop power or perks. So you effectively have two choices: raise the skill ceiling of killer by making every killer S tier like nurse, or lowering the skill ceiling for survivor. Now you might prefer option A, have all killers be nurse or blight strength, but for the majority of players that, you know, maybe have school, jobs, kids, pets, a goldfish even, basically anyone who doesn't play DBD 24/7, that's going to push them to another game. People only log on to DBD to have fun. If 80% of the player base is no longer having a fun experience, the game dies. There's no amount of just get good messages that are going to change reality. So let's talk about how we lower survivor's skill ceiling. The best example ever is Dead Hard. The original Dead Hard was one of the most broken perks that ever existed in Dead by Daylight, but only at the highest level of play. At low level, people would unironically tell you to just wait it out. They legitimately didn't understand the fundamental issue with the perk. However, by nerfing Dead Hard, absolutely nothing changed at the lowest level of play, whereas at the highest level of play, survivors became significantly weaker. Even if it was short-lived, this is how you balance DBD the right way. Not every game in general, just Dead by Daylight. Now moving on, Dead Hard is still the most used survivor perk in the game. It went from about a 50% usage rate down to around 30% after its nerf. At this point, the perk is completely worthless at low MMR. Yet again, at high MMR, it is just uncontested in terms of value. And you might ask, well, isn't that okay though, because it takes more skill to use now? Ask yourself the same question about nerfs. The key to the new Dead Hard is all about putting the killer in a situation where they have no choice but to swing and hope the survivor doesn't have Dead Hard. So now we're effectively going backwards, and the gap between the top survivors and average survivors is starting to widen once again. Is the new Dead Hard much more skillful? Yes, but again, skill ceiling will always be reached by tryhards. Plus, the same argument can be made about anything, and the end result is a less fun game for the majority of players. Let's quickly move on to map design. Now, I've gone into detail on a number of other videos, but for this one, I'll just use a small example. The Killer Shack. It appears in almost every map, and it's one of the most terribly designed tiles in the game at high level. It's an arbitrary time waste for 90% of the killer roster, even if the killer makes every right move and predicts the survivor movement with 100% accuracy. The best they get from it is a minute of wasted time and a broken pallet. For reference, that's enough time for the other survivors to finish 3 generators. But back in Boobot Town, the pallet gets dropped instantly, or the survivor survivor gets hit in 10 seconds. So what exactly is the solution to fixing Killer Shack? Well, fortunately, Behavior already figured that out, because on Dead Dog Saloon there's a breakable wall that gets rid of the God window. A simple little change that only exists on one map, but it makes such an incredible difference at high MMR. If we were able to get to a point where we had truly fair map design, we would finally need to see the end of the Bloodlust mechanic. You can't have completely balanced loops but keep Bloodlust, because killers would just cheese a hit at every pallet. So whether it's Nurse or Survivor, we can mostly all agree that skill ceiling having a cap is the healthiest move for the majority of DBD players. Okay, now let's go back to talking about killer playstyles and generator speed, specifically why you cannot balance the game simply around gen speed. For example, at the highest level of play, where let's say a Demogorgon main was playing against a stacked 4-man with sweated loadouts, the demo is going to quickly be forced to try and find a way to get one survivor dead, or they will lose the game. That's just a fact. So now let's say Behavior made gens take an extra 20 seconds each to complete. Well, now that Demogorgon can actually have an interesting chase-oriented match with those survivors, because the gens aren't just flying out of control. But what if the Demogorgon player doesn't feel like taking a bunch of chases and would rather just use their original strategy while benefiting from the additional 20 seconds per generator? That's basically an easy win. So you might say, okay, that might happen occasionally and it might be really annoying when it does, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not really such a big deal, is it? Well, what happens if the Demogorgon player is just simply not playing well, like they're actually making blatantly bad plays but can still fall back on using a cheesy strategy to win? They'll do it because that's how people play competitive games, denying survivors basically the ability to win matches. Now let's go even further, because at every level of the game this would have an enormous ripple effect down the MMR ladder that would make survivors lose to killers that are straight up worse players. Then you would have a situation where bad killers were getting sent up the MMR ladder and playing against better survivors, and then actually being forced to camp a tunnel because they simply don't know how to play the game well. It's a rabbit hole and the whole game comes undone pretty much. So if this discussion of increasing gen repair times comes up, it is 100% connected to tunneling and camping. It goes both ways as well. If the topic of tunneling and camping comes up, it is also tied to gen speed. So if Behavior decides to address any aspect of these foundational issues with DBD, they need to know they are all connected and you cannot change one without the other. This goes into our last big topic of discussion, which is whether you change player behavior through rewarding players or through punishing them. Let's take a look at Base Kit Borrowed Time, which was added to the game to punish killers for trying to camp and tunnel, but nothing was added to reward killers for going for multiple chases. In fact, Hex Ruin and Pop Goes the Weasel, two of the most rewarding perks in the game for pressuring generators, were completely nerfed into non-existence. So killers were even more de-incentivized to pressure gens or go for multiple chases. So even with Base Kit Borrowed Time, killers still went for the early kill. Behavior's next idea to fix this? Reassurance, to further punish killers for trying to get an early kill. Now here we are in the present and killers are still trying to get an early kill. If it's really not obvious at this point, I'll sum it up. Make going for multiple chases significantly more rewarding than getting an early kill. Now it's easy to just say these things, but what do they actually look like? Well, for one, they are not perks. Perks should make the game more interesting, not less like they do right now. Now I'm going to put out some suggestions with the disclaimer that all of these would need testing. DBD has a lot of layers to it, so there are no blanket ideas here. Starting with killer, corrupt intervention needs to become base kit. It can't be that the killer can lose a match within the first minute simply because the survivors got bullshit spawns or efficiently split up on gens. The early game in DBD still promotes shit gameplay, and if the price for this is Nurse getting taken out to pasture, by all means you can borrow my double barrel to do the job. Moving on to chases, a version of pre-nerf Pop Goes the Weasel with a minute timer should be added as base kit as well. The best way this could work is by tying in mobility of the killer to the percentage of regression. For example, Clown gets 40% regression with a pop kick because he has no map pressure. It needs to be worth the effort to pressure the gen. Meanwhile, Dredge gets a 20% regression kick because he can just teleport to the gen and kick it. This entire mechanic in general would be helpful in making weaker killers much more impactful. Now I know that a lot of players are bored of doing gens and want possibly a different objective altogether, which I'm all for, but I don't want to dive into that in this specific video. Okay, camping, proxy, and face camping. It's an incredibly powerful strategy even after all the punishments that have been tied to it. Now that we've added incentive for the killer not to camp, let's further solidify it being pointless to camp. And we'll do this in 3 parts. Alright, part 1. Before the exit gates are powered, the longer a killer is within a 24-meter radius of a hooked survivor, the slower the survivor dies on hook. Part 2. Once the killer is further than 24 meters from a hooked survivor, gen speed is reduced by 10%. So now we're simultaneously punishing survivors for trying to maximize hook timer efficiency. Part 3. Grabbing healthy survivors during an unhook is now impossible. It's just too juicy and tempting for a killer. So 3 parts that have mostly nothing to do with the endgame. Now the most common counter argument to this idea is that survivors will loop the killer around the hooked survivor. Now, what I don't like about this argument is that it reduces the killer player to being a giant baby with absolutely no decision-making skills. As killer, chasing a survivor while another survivor is on a hook nearby only leaves 2 survivors on gens, and one of those survivors will have to leave the gen to come get the unhook unless the person getting chased trades. Also, as killer, you are not forced to chase a survivor just because you see them. If the better option is to leave the hook to use your base kit pop on a gen and you don't do it, then you made a bad play and deserve to lose the game. Now, with no longer having grab games on unhooks, this dumb little mini game is removed and the survivors either take 2 hits for the unhook or trade. This will impact the endgame though, so killers would need to consider adding at least one endgame perk like save the best for last in their arsenal if they're just desperate to avoid that specific situation. In my opinion, the endgame isn't very interesting in general and might need looked at more, but not in this video. Now on to the most difficult problem to solve, tunneling. Whether it's hard tunneling, which means a killer only hunts 1 survivor until they're dead, or soft tunneling, which is when a killer prioritizes 2 survivors until they're dead, while mostly ignoring the other 2 survivors. The solution here is a new simple but elegant mechanic I like to call the repair tool. It's a double-sided mechanic that can benefit the survivor or the killer depending on the pacing of the match. If a survivor dies by any means early in a match, whether through being tunneled, camped, giving up on hook, or DCing, a repair tool will spawn in the locker closest to each remaining survivor. Once collecting their repair tools, their generator repair speeds will be permanently increased by 30% for the remainder of the trial, which not entirely makes up for a lost teammate, but does keep the match alive and interesting. However, going back to the punishment versus reward concept, we now need to reward the killer for not tunneling. This time we're going to punish the survivors for gen rushing. If too much gen progress has been achieved, whether the gens are actually finished or not, we're literally just talking about progress, before the killer has started to build momentum through getting hooks, the gens will be impossible to continue repairing without a gen repair tool. This time though, the repair tools will spawn in lockers as far away as possible from the survivor's current locations. This rewards killers for not tunneling and for running non-gen defense builds. Likewise, it punishes survivors for splitting up on gens, running gen rush builds, pre-dropping vital pallets early in the game, and helps even the playing field on disgustingly big maps, all while leaving the grass toucher experience completely intact. Moving on, survivors with endurance will no longer have any collision with the killer as they very often use their endurance to body block for teammates at high level play. If they can implement no collision with the killer during a guard hunt, they can implement it during endurance. I can't tell you how many times a survivor with off the record has purposely body blocked for a teammate that I'm chasing, which puts me in a situation where there's zero reason not to tunnel them at that point. They purposely used their defense as offense, and now the most optimal choice for me is to just kill them. So de-incentivize body blocking with endurance, and beyond that, if you're still having issues getting constantly tunneled, use more anti-tunnel perks, but overall it should be happening much less often. The last thing the devs could consider here is an incentive for killer to hook different survivors in order, like a multiplier where every time a killer hooks a different survivor from the last, they get a bonus, like more gen regression or faster movement speed outside of a chase, something like that. There's also an overarching problem with skill-based matchmaking that affects tunneling as well in a very big way, because you may have encountered an issue where every time you try playing the game with a friend or someone who doesn't dedicate their life to playing it, they get tunneled for being a weak looper. This is where a better version of the PIP system, DBD's original ranking system, would be immensely helpful over SBMM. If you're a red rank survivor and your friend is a yellow rank survivor, there's a big difference in skill. If you as the red rank go into yellow ranks, like survivors used to do on the old PIP system, you'll just 1v1 and destroy the baby killer. And if your friend comes to red ranks, they're dead first every time because the killer will immediately pick up on the fact that they have bad movement. So how an updated PIP system could fix this is by making you and your friend play against a killer somewhere in the middle between the both of you, like a green or purple rank killer. Now, to be fair, this same system could potentially be implemented in an SBMM system, but as far as I've been able to tell from Dead by Daylight's skill-based matchmaking system, it is widely less consistent than their PIP system was. Plus, with the PIP system, a survivor could still PIP even if they got tunneled for 5 gens, whereas right now they lose MMR for dying even if they did literally everything by themselves. So that's my starting draft on how to start the transition of balancing Dead by Daylight in a way that promotes healthy, fun matches for both sides, regardless of the skill level. Going forward, DBD will have more substantial competitors and whatnot, but DBD is the only thing that can kill DBD, so put a plan in action to start fixing the foundation of this game, and it will make every future balance decision 1,000 times easier. But again, those are just my initial ideas. Let me know if you agree or disagree or even have better ideas, and as always, thanks for watching and have a good one.